A pastiche is a work of literature in which one writer tries to successfully duplicate the voice and the technique of another. In other words, as an actor takes on a separate persona, separate characteristics of someone else, so a writer essentially writes a novel in the style of another writer. I think just about everyone does. There are certainly more Sherlock Holmes pastiche novels out there than about any other character. Everyone who comes in contact with the Holmesian universe wants to give it a try. Conan Doyle has immense powers of description. His characters are very, very vivid. And you just want to jump in. He's also very, very vague a lot of the time. Yeah, you can read some of the stuff and think, wait a minute. What I did, in essence, was to take the characters and events from Bram Stoker's Dracula and move them into the universe of Sherlock Holmes. The challenge here was, of course, to be faithful to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and to Bram Stoker. In other words, not disturb the source material, yet still come up with a wholly original story. The idea really started back in high school. I was researching a paper. I think I was in the 9th grade. I was in the library. I was bored. Went into the stacks and came out with The Hound of the Baskervilles. And I stayed up all night reading it. I didn't finish it until 2 o'clock in the morning. That led, of course, to more Sherlock Holmes. And from there, of course, reading all sorts of other Victorian literature, including Dracula. And by the time I came to Dracula, it just came to me, Sherlock is right down the street from these places. He would be on the scene. He would know what is going on. Well, the first decision I had to make was which universe to use. If I were going to use the Dracula universe, it would have to be a supernatural story, and it's much harder to fit Sherlock Holmes in that because Holmes is so rational. So, the first decision, the Conan Doyle universe. And therefore, I also figured, and I think I was right in this, that it would be easier to find science to explain the supernatural than just to have things happen magically. Well, this is where it got tricky with the technique. I had to. This is one of the reasons I wrote a novel in the style of Dracula. In other words, a series of letters and journals as opposed to straight narrative, which is what Conan Doyle always did. To bring Dracula into that universe, you therefore had to get the timeline down from Dracula, which luckily is done quite neatly. Every single chapter in Dracula has a date on it. So you arrange the calendar, so you know where Dracula is going to be on any given day. And then you do the same thing with Sherlock Holmes. I mean, fortunately, a scholar by the name of William Baring-Gould went ahead and did that. So I had to lay that chronology over the Dracula chronology, so you know where Sherlock Holmes and Dracula are at any given time. You then look for a place where you can bring them together, and that's how I did it. That's how I found a series of events making it possible for the Count and Sherlock Holmes to have their fight. I have heard from better writers than myself that you don't want to plot it too much. I was listening to an interview with Elmore Leonard on public radio the other day, and he says, I just make it up as I go along. Ed McBain would say, I never plot more than a chapter or two ahead. And I found out why. Because in the course of writing, things occur to you that didn't occur to you when you were trying to lay it out. I'll give you an example. And when I mentioned the chronology earlier, 1890, what happened to Sherlock Holmes in 1890? Well, as it turned out, Silver Blaze happened in 1890 during the period when Dracula was in England. And in Dracula, it mentions a certain location, which I could pull from Silver Blaze. That gave me the excuse to send Holmes and Watson to this location, and I was able to bring in Van Helsing. And Van Helsing, of course, has to come into the story at some point. This is where Van Helsing meets Holmes and Watson. I believe in it. Well, I've been reading Conan Doyle all my life. I've read Dracula 15, 20 times. And so getting that voice down is fairly easy. But you have to be careful with it, because if you fall too much into it, you're going to wind up parodying Conan Doyle, and of course if you're unintentionally writing parody, everybody reading it will know that and start cracking up. You don't want that. You also have to be careful to keep modern language and modern usage out of your story. That's the hard part. They talked differently back then. They used words differently. There weren't as many words, for one thing. Conan Doyle didn't know what a computer is as we would know a computer. I had to reimagine them. People are, of course, extremely familiar with Dracula, extremely familiar with Sherlock Holmes, so they were easier, really, than the others, they're in support. If they were real people, they would all have their life histories, their own personalities, and all that, and I would have to fill them in based on what was already written before. One of the problems with Dracula, I found out, was that Van Helsing and Dracula are the only fully realized characters in those two books. The others, all the other men are basically interchangeable. I don't think anyone knows what Dr. Seward looks like. He's not described, as far as I remember, anywhere in the book. So that provided the opportunity, of course, to fill in those gaps and to draw a clearer picture. Now I'm writing a contemporary mystery story with contemporary characters and a modern plot, and I'm having a great time doing it. The response to Sherlock Holmes and the Plague of Dracula was very gratifying. The reviews have been mostly good, all but one or two. And I intend to keep going. I'm going to keep writing. There are two more Sherlock Holmes books I want to write. One of them fills in Holmes's childhood. We have not had a Holmes Begins story, I don't think, except for The Adventure of the Gloria Scott. And the other book I would like to write would be to tell the fuller story of Charles Augustus Milverton, known as the Master Blackmailer. That's one of the more interesting stories in the Conan Doyle canon, and raised a lot of fascinating questions. At one point in that story, for instance, Holmes impersonates a plumber and actually gets himself engaged to get into Milverton's house. That's so completely out of character for him. We have to wonder why. So I think it would take a full novel to explain that, and when I get the time to research it, I will write it.